Back in June, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. went on the always credible Dr. Phil's talk show to try to drop some truth bombs about industry capture and the vaccine industry. Was he right? Of course not. Hey, I'm Dr. Wilson. I'm a PhD molecular biologist, and welcome to Day 3 of Debunking Week. One of Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s favorite claims to make is that the FDA and Big Pharma are colluding in an effort to sell you dangerous pharmaceutical drugs that the FDA doesn't actually regulate. This is just not true, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. himself cannot point to a single example of a drug that Big Pharma bribed the FDA to approve, even though it shouldn't have been approved. And don't get me wrong, you can find plenty of examples of drugs, even in recent history, that were overused, misused, marketed off-label, or there was found to be a problem somewhere down the line after approval. But you cannot find examples of pharma bribing its drugs through the FDA, which is the implication of what Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is saying. He's implying that there are huge conflicts of interest and that drugs are just skating by even though problems are emerging. They're just being overlooked, all that stuff. None of that is true. But he seemed to completely convince Dr. Phil that this was the case. So let's listen to a few clips from that conversation and then go through the content.
The government regulators have been bought off by Big Pharma. I think that's what you're saying when you say that this entanglement has occurred. You said agency employees are actually getting royalties, getting payments on vaccines and drugs that they approve. Is that true?
So there are two different claims being made here. One is concerning the funding of the FDA, which comes from both Congress and from the pharmaceutical industry through fees that they have to pay in order to get their stuff reviewed by the FDA. The other issue is royalties paid to NIH scientists who make inventions that then get approved in the market. Let's start with FDA funding and what Robert F. Kennedy Jr. specifically says about it.
Yes, there's a couple of things happening with FDA. About 50% of FDA's budget comes from regulated industries, so mainly the pharmaceutical industries. You have agency capture on steroids. The principal objective of FDA today is to serve the mercantile interests of pharmaceutical companies.
He'll tell you that the FDA gets a significant portion of its budget from pharmaceutical industries, but he won't tell you why. These are service fees that pharmaceutical industries pay whenever they submit material for the FDA to review. These are out-of-pocket fees that pharmaceutical industries pay to a federal agency so that they can do their job, and so that taxpayers don't have to pay that money ourselves. That's like arguing that because you pay to get your car inspected, that means that you're colluding with car inspectors and they're not actually overseeing anything. It's a really lazy argument for him to make, but it's one people will believe because he's a lawyer. But if you take just a little bit of time to look into it, you'll find there's nothing to it. Bribery and fraud are very clear crimes, and if it was happening on a large scale very frequently between the FDA and pharmaceutical companies, we would know about it. In fact, I don't know of any cases of bribery or fraud in recent history between the pharmaceutical companies and the FDA. I could be wrong, there might be one, but even if there were, you'd have to take it on a case-by-case basis. You can't just say, oh, bribery is a possibility, so therefore all drugs and all pharmaceutical companies are being bribed through the FDA because I say so. That's like saying you're never going to eat at a restaurant because the restaurant could just bribe the health inspector and pay them off. It's just a nonsensical way to look at the world. The fact is that if the pharmaceutical companies want the FDA employees to do the hard work of reviewing their reams of data that come with every drug submission, then they have to pay them for that work. So unless Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has a specific case of bribery for each vaccine that he wants to criticize and say is corrupt, then he doesn't really have an argument here. In reality, pharmaceutical companies will, across the board, say that working with the FDA is not an easy process. Regulators at the FDA reviewing a submission for a vaccine or drug will always have comments, additional work, and things to say about any submission. That is the norm. And it's not uncommon for the FDA to flat out reject drugs when they're submitted. That's part of the reason why most drugs fail before getting to phase 3 clinical trials, because pharmaceutical companies know that they can't push crap past the FDA. It has to be good data showing safety and efficacy, or else the FDA is gonna reject it. Now let's move on to this claim about NIH royalties. What Dr. Phil says here is just kind of mind-blowing. Like, I don't know what's going on in his noodle to think that inventors don't deserve compensation for their work. But let's just hear what he says.
Not just for their lives, but their children. As long as that mRNA technology is on the market, they're going to be making money from it.
Okay, now,
that is a conflict.
Hang on a minute now, because I don't want to blow by this too fast. So the National Institute of Health is getting a kickback, a bribe, a royalty, a share, whatever you want to call it. Is this not a clear conflict of interest?
Yes.
That's what you're pointing out, right?
A conflict of interest for what? The NIH doesn't write policy about vaccines. It doesn't even make recommendations about vaccines. That's what the CDC does. The CDC can make recommendations about vaccines, but Congress are the people who actually write laws about it. The NIH is a federal body that funds and employs researchers who research basic questions concerning human health. Most of this kind of work goes to projects that examine fundamental questions about our scientific world. How does this protein in a cell work? How does this gene affect this disease? Can this gene affect this disease? What are the risk factors of people in this certain group who get this disease? Those kinds of questions are what the NIH focuses on. But sometimes, researchers within the NIH working on those kinds of questions might make a discovery that leads to an invention of a product or a medicine that can help people with that disease. In that situation, those people get royalties because it's their invention. I thought we lived in capitalist America where that was supposed to happen, but apparently Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Dr. Phil are just mind blown by this concept that inventors deserve compensation for the good work that they put into the world. Why is that a weird concept? And again, there's just no conflict of interest here. The NIH doesn't affect policy around this stuff. The NIH is strictly a research-based federal organization. I mean, the alternative to 50% of the Moderna vaccine being owned by the NIH is 100% of it being owned by a pharmaceutical company, in which case we wouldn't have a significant amount of the profits it makes going back into the NIH and back into basic research into fundamental questions of human health, research that ultimately gets at root questions that can ultimately lead to breakthroughs in medicine for diseases that none of us want to suffer from, which is what happens to the rest of the money that doesn't go to the inventors as royalties. That amount of royalties is capped at $150,000 per year. RFK Jr. is right when he says that. The rest of it goes into research. Why does Robert F. Kennedy Jr. want more money to go to Big Pharma instead of research that benefits you and me directly? This is what happens when you drill into these claims. You find that they are totally backwards and don't even make sense internally. There is no bribery or corruption in what RFK Jr. is describing here. What's happening here is that instead of going to Big Pharma, money is going to researchers who invented a product and are receiving rightful compensation for it. And the rest of that money is going back into basic research that ultimately can only benefit you and me, instead of going to the pockets of the shareholders of a pharma company. Only an anti-vaxxer like RFK Jr. could spin a positive story like that into one that incites fear and rage so that you support him and donate to him and make him richer and more famous. But now that you've seen this, hopefully you'll be smarter than Dr. Phil and not fall for that kind of nonsense. That's going to do it for day 3 of Debunking Week. As always, all the links to all the science that I talk about in this video are in the description below so that you can check them out for yourself. And if you enjoyed this, then don't forget to subscribe so you can catch me tomorrow where I'll be debunking some more funky stuff. See you then.